In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how I made this micro paludarium. I'm going to start off by making the tank. You'll need some 3mm glass, a ruler, a glass cutter, and a marker pen. I used the ruler to measure the desired length and then made a small mark with the Sharpie. I'll do my best to leave links to the materials I've used in the description below. I then hold the ruler in place and score a line down the glass. And now it's easy as just snapping them in half. Cutting glass can take some practice, but it's easy enough once you get the hang of it. My biggest tips would be to double check your measurements and apply consistent even force when cutting the glass. Before moving on, I like to make sure all the pieces fit together properly. To do this, I use some electrical tape to hold everything in place. At this point, the glass is still sharp and hasn't been sanded yet, so handle it with care. It all fits together perfectly, so I will now take it apart and sand all the edges down. I recommend you do this over a sink with wet sandpaper. This will eliminate any glass dust that is produced. Before moving on, make sure all the glass is dry and free of debris. This next step isn't completely necessary, but it will definitely give your tank a much cleaner look. Using masking tape, I carefully outline all the edges where silicone will be applied. Remember, when doing this, it's important to account for the thickness of the glass. As you can see, I taped this piece here slightly bigger than the thickness of the glass. I repeated this for every piece of glass. To attach them, I'll be using this marine grade silicone. I'll put a link to this one or one very similar in the description below. As this tank is so small, I'll be putting the silicone in this syringe to make it easier to apply to the glass. If you're doing the same, make sure you remove the excess air before you start. When applying the silicone, it's a case of creating a consistent small bead roughly the thickness of the glass. In this case, that'll be 3mm. Don't worry if this stage isn't the neatest, as it can always be tidied up. As you can see, I've laid out all the panels in their correct position with some tape on the side to make it easier to assemble. To join the two edges, apply some gentle force until you see some silicone squirting out either side. Before attaching the last panel, I use this small round stick to smoothen out all the edges. This ensures the silicone is evenly applied throughout the glass, which will help prevent leaks. I then attach the last panel and make sure everything is squared. The next step is to peel the tape off. It's important to do this whilst the silicone is still wet. As you can see, the edges are really neat. After roughly 24 hours, the silicone will now have cured, and it's now time to peel off the tape and start tidying up the glass. As you can see, there's plenty of imperfections that can be easily taken off with a razor blade. It goes without saying that blades are very sharp, so be careful. Here's the end result. By no means is it professionally made, but I'm still very happy with how it looks. Before moving on, it's important to do a water test to make sure there's no leaks. A few hours have passed and everything is looking good, so it's time to move on with the build. For the background, I'll be using this tree fern fibre, as plants and moss love to grow on it. I marked down the dimensions and then carefully cut it to size. I felt like it was a little too thick for the small tank, so I decided to cut it in half. That's much better. Now it's time for the moss, and for this paludarium I'm going to be using Hypnum moss. To attach it to the background, I'll be securing it in place with this thread. I poke one of the ends through a small hole and then tie it in place. And then it's just a case of placing the moss on the tree fern panel and then using the thread to wrap round and hold it in place. Although the thread is barely visible, over time the moss should grow and you won't be able to see it at all. Before continuing, I gave the moss and panel a good spray down. This will stop them from drying out. Time to add some details. I want to create some downward root-like structures, and these twigs are the perfect hardscape for that. As you can see, I'm using some pliers to cut them to the desired shape and height. And then it was just a case of finding an arrangement that I liked. It's always good to spend that little bit of extra time with the hardscape. Here's the final result. To hold them in place, I gently wedged them under the thread that's holding the moss down. And as you can see, I twisted them out slightly to give them more of a 3D look. Time for the plants. I'll be using oak leaf fig, Hydrocotyle, and this Peperomia emarginella, which has some beautiful turtleback leaves. All these plants have small miniature leaves which will lend itself nicely to the scale of the scape. To plant them, I used the twigs from the hardscape to act as anchor points to hold them all in place. With time they'll root themselves to the tree fern panel. That's the majority of the planting done for now, time to move on in the build. Next I'm going to use some small slate stone pieces to create a retaining wall that will prevent the substrate from falling down into the front. To join them together I used super glue. Here's the end result. I think the small textures of the stone match the scale of this Paludarium perfectly. I place another piece of slate stone in the foreground to act as a wedge. This will hold the retaining wall in place and stop it getting too close to the glass. For the substrate I'll be using aqua soil. I use a small spoon to carefully pour it in place behind the wall. And then with this trusty tool I gently pat it down into place. If you're enjoying this video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss any future builds. Now it's time to place the background inside the Paludarium. It instantly brings this mini tank to life. But it can do with some more moss to fill in the gaps just behind the wall. For this, I found some moss in my back garden that would fit perfectly in this scape. I used some tweezers to carefully get them in place. I'm pretty sure the species of this moss is thread moss, but it's always hard to tell when you collect it from outside. Now I'm going to add some sand to the foreground of the water feature. I only want a super thin layer. I then added some small slate stone pieces on top of the sand. This will help create a better transition down from the larger pieces. Next I gave the tank a good spray down before continuing to fill up the water feature. As always, I then placed some duckweed on top of the water. I only placed in a few pieces as this plant grows like crazy. Without a lid, the moss and plants will be prone to drying out. With some spare glass, I made one to fit perfectly. I'm very happy with the end result, and given some time to grow, I think it would look even better. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this build and would like to see more like it where I show you how to build a tank from scratch. Now if you like this build, you're going to like this one, where I show you how to turn a vase into a Paludarium.